April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The oxygen mask couldn't quite hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen's smirk as he watched the ungainly silhouette struggling to climb toward his formation. He was looking through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26, a young man of 26, studied the American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," he transmitted to his wingman, unable to stifle his laughter at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts fighting for altitude. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumbered upward in tight formation. Their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. To German pilots used to the sleek Spitfires and nimble Soviet fighters, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. They had barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, and propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Hermichen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror. Their 850 caliber Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation began that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran, who had transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier, understood what his men didn't yet know: that survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from conventional fighter design philosophy. While the Germans had pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and turn performance, Republic Aviation had created something unprecedented: a high-altitude juggernaut that used mass, power, and firepower to redefine the rules of aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939, with veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This story is about how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how German pilots' laughter turned to terror as they discovered what synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from a June 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that redefined the possible. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his design team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question. This thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. It ground-looped on landing, torque rolled on takeoff, and dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, their controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, described his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s, couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109s, and couldn't match their nimble handling at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses, attacking from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled, forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Hutchman Isef Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. The statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to notice. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter cold. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early warfighters or the cannons with limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. The event that would begin changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Luz, France. It involved 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict. Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the Angstadt JG-26, led by Headman Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers, taking catastrophic damage in the first seconds of combat. 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling was torn away, and fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, tried to bail out, but discovered the canopy was jammed. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, a barely functioning engine that shook violently, and controls that responded only intermittently, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that would have reduced any other fighter to falling debris. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown pilot from 2JG-26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 Mach. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load. Then the German repositioned and fired again, this time with only his machine guns. The cannon ammunition exhausted, the German pilot pulled alongside, staring in disbelief at the flying wreck. Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear. The German repositioned and emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt. Still, it flew. He pulled alongside again, shook his head in apparent amazement, gave an informal salute, and peeled away, presumably out of ammunition. Johnson's P-47 landed at Manston with its engine failing on the runway. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine had taken direct hits. The control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shock waves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. German intelligence, receiving combat reports from the Jagdgeschwader 26, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment. But testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver and survived. By July 1943, American pilots were learning to exploit the P-47's true strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially seen as a disadvantage, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 mph, faster than any German fighter could achieve, even in a vertical dive. This speed could be converted to altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters hopelessly behind. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could effectively operate. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, reaching speeds that made deflection shooting impossible for defending Germans. At the bottom of these dives, the American heavy machine guns would speak. German pilots who survived described it as facing a wall of lead, the combined firepower creating an impenetrable zone of destruction. Aircraft caught in this convergence pattern didn't just fall. They disintegrated. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943, dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date. This mission would demonstrate both the P-47's limitations, its range, even with drop tanks, and its terrifying effectiveness when employed properly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyer aircraft positioning to attack B-17s with their heavy cannon and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable, were the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Me-110s who survived, later recounted in a POW interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tails severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a 110 became nothing. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were destroyed in less than a minute. The German pilots had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,000 to 400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 150 caliber projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself was a revelation of American industrial capacity. While German fighters struggled with limited cannon ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm weapon, American pilots could maintain fire for over half a minute. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect. When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down. They explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The pilot never knew what hit him. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude while German fighters suffered. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained its rated power output up to 30,000 feet. German fighters relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers saw their performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot on his way to ace status, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philip's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report was clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Philip's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? The German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor included a 3D8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, one 2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates around the engine. Most disturbingly, its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47D-22 featured a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades 13 feet in diameter, with broad chord blades that bit into the air like massive oars. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight. Hedman Heinz Knocker of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The distinctive thundering roar created by the blade tips reaching supersonic speeds could be heard from miles away. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone. A deep, threatening rumble that meant death from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried 2 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign. But this required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition. German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on fear for the big American fighters. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, transformed into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death. The escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage: endurance. While German fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, the big American radials could cruise efficiently at high altitude. Thunderbolts could remain with the bombers for hours, rotating top cover while maintaining enough fuel for combat and return. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over long-range escort duties in spring 1944, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The transition began in earnest in April 1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles, while the sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into a true multi-role monster. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying, engines roaring, rockets screaming, then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them jabos, fighter bombers. But these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day, reported, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our Gruppe. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically destroyed German movement in daylight. The statistics were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives, 3847 trucks, 5 and 12 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,153 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, and developed new camouflage techniques. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made them nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. While devastating Europe, the P-47 was simultaneously proving its worth in the Pacific theater. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, discovered that the Thunderbolt's qualities were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics specifically for the Pacific. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, shooting down 6 enemy planes himself in a single mission, earning him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the P-47's combination of firepower and durability. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered P-47s over New Guinea, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannons, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart. The P-47N, developed specifically for the Pacific, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, extending range to 2,350 miles. This variant would escort B-29s to Japan, proving that the short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 262, with its 540 mph top speed, should have been untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. But Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in 2 situations: during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me 262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 mph, fast enough to catch the jet in level flight. The jet pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's guns opened up at 400 yards. Meyer's combat report noted, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both wings, were observed falling from the sky. The engines were ripped away from the fuselage. The pilot didn't make it out. The intense barrage from those 50 caliber machine guns turned out to be way more effective against jet aircraft than we initially thought." By early 1945, they started deploying specialized P-47M variants specifically to take on German jets and V-1 flying bombs, with water methanol injection giving the engine a boost up to 2,800 horsepower and some slicked-up aerodynamics. These ultimate Thunderbolts could hit 470 mph in level flight at 30,000 feet. That was fast enough to even intercept jets under certain circumstances. Major George Bostwick, who was in charge of the 63rd Fighter Squadron and their P-47s, managed to shoot down 2 Me 262s in March of '45. In his tactical report, he made it clear that firepower was more important than speed. He said, "The jets are faster, but they can't turn with us, and they sure can't take the kind of punishment we dish out. One good burst from our guns, and they just fall apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down when they're attacking the bombers, and that's when we get them." The ultimate display of American industrial might came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to wipe out Allied air power on January 1, 1945. Almost 900 German fighters, including some of their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields all over Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, where the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s were stationed. The attack was a success at first. German fighters managed to destroy 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with a bunch of other aircraft. A captured German pilot who was brought to the command post pointed at the burning planes and sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking's response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line where the ground crews were already pushing the damaged aircraft out of the way and getting the hard stands ready for replacements. "By tomorrow," he said, "we'll have 40 new ones. How long is it going to take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk disappeared pretty quick. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 D-40s were filling up the flight line. They were flown in from depots over in England. The Luftwaffe ended up losing 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte. And that included a lot of instructors and squadron leaders that they just couldn't afford to lose. These were losses they could never recover from. The Americans lost a total of 134 aircraft across all the airfields that were attacked. But they were all replaced within a week. The numbers really told the story of how things were inevitably going to end. Republic Aviation cranked out 15,783 P-47s during the war, which was more than any other American fighter. At the peak of production, the factory in Farmingdale on Long Island was turning out one Thunderbolt every hour, around the clock. The plant in Evansville, Indiana, which was built from empty farmland back in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft a month by 1944. Each P-47D needed 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone had 2,400 individual components, all machined to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch. And yet, American workers, a lot of them women who had never even seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, were putting these complex machines together with a precision that was even better than peacetime standards. The ammunition production was just as mind-blowing. Every P-47 sortie needed 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and there were hundreds of Thunderbolts flying missions every single day. By the middle of 1944, they were using over 10 million rounds of ammunition every month. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, which was just one of several ammunition plants, was producing 30 million rounds every month. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, making sure they fed reliably through the synchronized gun mechanisms. The fuel consumption was also insane. Each Thunderbolt burned through 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, and up to 300 gallons in combat when the water injection was engaged. The 9th Air Force alone was burning through over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel every month by late 1944. And all of that fuel was shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were also products of American mass production. Even more impressive than the aircraft production was the pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots a year from advanced training. That's more than Germany had trained in the entire war. Every P-47 pilot got at least 400 hours of flight training before they went into combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. German pilots, on the other hand, were going into combat with less than 100 hours of total flight time by the end of the war. The difference in quality really showed in combat. American pilots arrived in Europe trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, and tactics. They had even practiced against captured German aircraft, so they understood what their enemy could and couldn't do. They knew their own aircraft inside and out, having studied technical manuals that German pilots never even saw. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September of 1944, was a perfect example of the American training advantage. He said, "I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, and studied gun camera footage from actual combat. When I flew my first mission, I knew exactly what I was doing." The German pilot I was up against couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. In March of 1945, Oberleutnant Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials who were trying to boost morale. But his statement was considered too demoralizing to be published. It revealed just how much German attitudes had changed. He said, "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unbelievable. The guns never jam, never overheat, and you never run out of ammunition in a normal fight. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when it needs to. But what's even more important is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots are better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, and spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just a way to delay the inevitable." We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. That sound haunts us. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us because of better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. By April of 1945, the Luftwaffe was pretty much just a name on paper. Fuel shortages had grounded most of their aircraft. Their experienced pilots were either dead or captured, and their airfields were just a bunch of bomb craters. But even if they had aircraft and fuel, German pilots were facing a situation they just couldn't win. Attacking meant flying into P-47 formations that controlled the skies from the ground all the way up to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brückler, who was one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly 1 combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted all of 12 seconds. He said, "I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it had been hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded and the wings separated. I barely got out. While I was in my parachute, I watched them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky was raining burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots started developing what the medical officers called Jabo fever, which was basically physical symptoms of stress that would appear whenever Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and hurricanes without any fear were suddenly getting physically sick before missions against P-47s. The distinct rumble of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops, who knew that their only chance of survival was to find cover immediately. The final statistics of P-47 operations are almost impossible to wrap your head around. In Europe, they destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in aerial combat, 315 aircraft on the ground, 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles. In the Pacific, they destroyed 697 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat, 150 aircraft on the ground, 2,500 vehicles, 150 locomotives, and countless barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force alone, which was mostly equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. The Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.6.1 kill ratio in aerial combat, and they also had the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. But behind all these numbers was a huge human cost. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 28,000 pilots, killed in combat against Western Allied forces. A lot of them were killed by the concentrated fire from American heavy machine guns. And every one of those losses represented years of training that Germany just couldn't replace. By the end of the war, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center in Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were debriefed by German intelligence. The records that were captured in 1945 revealed the German assessments of Allied aircraft. The file on the P-47, which was updated constantly throughout the war, showed just how much their opinion had changed. In April of 1943, they wrote, "Large, unmaneuverable fighter. Inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed. Machine gun armament insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment, minimal threat." By December of 1943, they had changed their tune. Exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower increasingly problematic, pilots showing improved tactics, assessment, significant threat above 25,000 feet. In June of 1944, the assessment was even more dire. Dominant fighter-bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment, critical threat at all altitudes. And by March of 1945, they were completely terrified. Best fighter-bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment, unsurvivable in direct engagement. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former enemies met in peace. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who used to be the head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response, which was recorded on video, perfectly captured the complete turnaround. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he said. "We saw this big, heavy fighter and we laughed. We thought, the Americans don't understand air combat. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. But we were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans weren't trying to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. And they were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable, the visibility was excellent, and the controls were precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. And yet, they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The P-47's design perfectly represented American industrial philosophy. Brute force engineering backed by unlimited resources. Every component was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, which was 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout, with automatic backup systems, Even the ammunition feed system was a marvel of engineering. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, fed through electric boost motors to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. The convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, allowing pilots to optimize for their preferred engagement range. Even after the war, some German veterans insisted that the P-47 won through quantity, not quality. They claimed that German fighters were technically superior, but they were just overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But the combat records tell a different story. In engagements where the numbers were equal, P-47s consistently came out on top. The heavy machine gun armament, which was often dismissed as inferior to cannons, turned out to be more effective in actual combat. Analysis of gun camera footage showed why. Cannon shells, while they were individually more destructive, required precise aim, and they had a limited supply of ammunition, typically only 120 to 200 rounds total. The P-47's guns, on the other hand, created a cloud of bullets that guaranteed hits, even if the pilot's aim wasn't perfect. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst would put at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, which was more than enough to ensure its destruction. The ammunition itself was also superior. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed action fuse that made sure the round penetrated the target before it detonated. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which was hot enough to ignite aluminum structures. German 20mm shells, while they were heavier, often exploded on surface contact, which caused impressive-looking damage, but sometimes it was only superficial. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter that was ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds was more than the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. And its guns delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet, it was built by the thousands, flown by kids who were barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in a matter of weeks. The transformation of German opinion, from mockery to terror, took less than 2 years. In that time, the flying milk bottle became the most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke about P-47s in hushed tones, even decades after the war. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, there's a restored P-47D sitting among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists its specifications and battle honors. But the real story is told by a small display case that contains some spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot, taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of ridicule, and it ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April of 1943. By May of 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.